Imagine waking up one morning, but something feels wrong. Your name has become something forbidden. The language you speak is considered illegal, and the country you once called home simply no longer exists on any map. There is no war happening in front of you, no bombs falling. Yet everything you once knew about the world has been silently and completely erased. And the most terrifying part is that this is not a work of science fiction, but a scenario that was once planned in meticulous and chilling detail. And if just a few battles in 1941 had gone differently, you might never have had the chance to sit here and watch this video, because the world we know today simply would not exist. Today, we step into one of the darkest what-if scenarios in human history. What would happen if Adolf Hitler had won World War II? And what makes this scenario so disturbing is not imagination, but the fact that it is built upon real documents, real military, economic, and architectural plans that were already prepared. A world not invented after the fact, but a future that once came dangerously close to becoming reality. If Nazi Germany had won, Eastern Europe would not merely have been occupied as in typical wartime scenarios, but the entire region would have been erased in the truest sense of the word. Not controlled, not governed, but completely wiped away under a plan known as General Plan Ost. Tens of millions of people were marked for removal, including Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and many other Slavic groups. Historians estimate that between 30 and 50 million people would have been deported, enslaved, or killed, not because they resisted, but simply because they existed. Entire cultures would vanish. Languages would disappear from history. Identities would be reduced to nothing, and the vast lands they once inhabited would be transformed into settlement areas for Germans, a colonial empire in the heart of Europe, where any survivors would be stripped of all human rights, denied education, denied any future, existing only to serve. At the same time, the center of power in this new world would no longer be Berlin as we know it, but would be reborn as a massive megacity called Germania, a symbol of absolute dominance, designed by the architect Albert Speer, where everything was built not to serve people, but to make them feel small and insignificant. At the heart of this city would stand the People's Hall, a colossal structure capable of holding up to 180,000 people, with a dome so enormous that it was believed human breath and heat alone could create clouds inside it. This was no longer architecture, but psychological control, a way to ensure that anyone who entered would feel their individuality dissolve, understanding that they held no personal importance, that everything existed solely with the power of the state. However, controlling land and people was still not enough to sustain such an empire. Nazi Germany also developed an even more brutal strategy, turning the most basic element of survival into a weapon, food itself, under what became known as the Hunger Plan. Millions were deliberately condemned to starvation. German planners openly acknowledged that if Germany were to survive and continue the war, others would have to die. Food supplies from occupied territories, especially from the Soviet Union, would be seized entirely to feed German soldiers and civilians, while the local populations were left behind to starve, not due to oversight or failure, but as a calculated part of the plan, a form of genocide without gunfire or explosions, slow, silent, and inescapable, where death arrived day by day through deprivation. On the other side of the world, Germany's ally, Imperial Japan, was also reshaping global order with its own vision, constructing a vast sphere of influence across Asia and the Pacific. known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a name that suggested liberation from Western colonial powers, but in reality concealed a system of large-scale exploitation. Southeast Asian countries would become sources of oil, rubber, and food to fuel the war machine. And even nations like Vietnam would not exist as independent states, but as controlled territories where language, education, and culture were restructured under imperial authority. All resources extracted and directed toward the center of power, while local populations were reduced to components within a massive system.
Yet perhaps the most striking and unsettling reality is that even if they had won, this system already carried the seeds of its own destruction. The Nazi economy was not built on sustainable growth or innovation, but on continuous expansion and looting. It functioned only as long as there were new lands to conquer and new resources to seize. Once there was nothing left to take, the entire structure would begin to collapse. And even more critically, they weakened themselves by driving out some of their greatest minds for ideological reasons. Scientists like Albert Einstein were forced into exile, stalling scientific and technological progress. A society built on fear and rigid control cannot nurture creativity, and without creativity, it inevitably falls behind. So if all of this had become reality, what would the world look like today? There would be no free internet, no explosion of global innovation, no international cooperation. Instead, there would be a constant state of tension, a permanent Cold War between two totalitarian superpowers, Germany and Japan, each watching, distrusting, and preparing for the next inevitable conflict. And in such a world, a person's value would not be determined by talent, effort, or intelligence, but by bloodline, origin, and rigid racial hierarchies where opportunity does not exist, and freedom is a concept that was never allowed to be born. What makes this scenario truly haunting is not only its brutality, but how close it came to reality. This is not a nightmare imagined long after the fact, but a path history nearly followed. And the reason it did not happen lies in the sacrifices of millions, in the resistance of those who refused to accept such a future. And perhaps the most important realization is not just how terrifying that world would have been, but how fragile history truly is. How a few moments, a few decisions, can completely reshape the course of human existence and define the reality we live in today. If you feel chills at these plans, hit like to spread this historical truth. Which Germania project do you think was the craziest? Leave your opinion in the comments. History didn't unfold as Hitler expected due to economic mistakes and the heroic resistance of humanity. To better understand the real reasons why Nazi Germany failed, despite being so close to victory, click on the video currently playing on your screen about Hitler's deadly economic mistakes. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next historical mysteries. See you soon.